Welcome to a new episode of the show. Imagine for a moment, dear intelligent viewer, that you are a seagull flying over the Mediterranean Sea, heading east. You arrive at a point on the coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa, where you encounter a stunningly beautiful place known today as Dor. It's an ideal summer destination that rivals the beaches of Greece, Cyprus, and Sicily, with its soft sand, pleasant weather, and friendly locals. Behind the shoreline lies lush green farmland. If you are a fan of history and geography, you'll find a museum and archaeological sites dating back to the Bronze Age. There are also numerous houses that look like they were transported directly from Florida, blending in perfectly with the modern resorts full of amenities. However, as you soar above, still imagining yourself as a seagull, you notice something strange. A modern resort named Nasholim stands out, but just meters away, there is an old Arab-style house breaking the harmony of the area. Let me tell you that in 1991, one of the residents decided to build a diving center next to that house. Workers and equipment were brought in, and excavation began. However, the work abruptly stopped when they uncovered human bones buried in a shallow grave. A fisherman named Fuad Hassad, who lived in a nearby Arab village called Al-Faradis, noticed the halt and asked the project owner about the discovery. The owner simply replied, "We found bones from Napoleon's era." Fuad retorted, "No, these are bones of Palestinians massacred in 1948 and buried here." Fuad explained that his father and grandfather had told him about a massacre committed by Israeli soldiers in the area and that the victims were buried in mass graves. One of these graves lies beneath a parking lot for the Nasholim resort. This all happened before the resort was built and before the area was renamed Dor. It used to be a Palestinian fishing village called Tantura. Tantura was a small, peaceful Palestinian village south of Haifa, with about 1,500 residents who depended on fishing and farming. After the Nakba catastrophe of 1948, for nearly 50 years, Israelis referred to Tantura as just a site of a battle during the War of Independence, where Arabs were defeated, and the village's residents moved to Al-Faradis. Settlers later came and established a kibbutz called Nasholim. This narrative persisted until 1998, when an Israeli graduate student at the University of Haifa, named Theodore Katz, published his master's thesis. While researching, Katz interviewed veterans of the Alexandroni Brigade, a unit of the Israeli army responsible for capturing Tantura on May 22, 1948. Based on these interviews, Katz discovered that what happened in Tantura was not a battle between two armed groups. Instead, despite the villagers' attempts to resist, their weak weaponry and lack of combat experience led to their defeat even before the battle began. The villagers' surrender, however, did not save them from massacre. On the night of May 22 and the morning of May 23, Israeli soldiers invaded Tantura and committed a massacre. They first separated the men from the women. The women were stripped of their money, gold, and anything valuable, then forced out of the village, not knowing where to go. The men, on the other hand, were gathered near the beach, where the same old Arab-style house still stands. The term men here didn't just refer to adults. Any boy who looked over 13 years old was considered a man. At the Arab house, the massacre began. The testimonies gathered by Theodore Katz from the soldiers were horrifying. These testimonies were later featured in a documentary called Tantura, directed by an Israeli filmmaker named Alon Schwartz. One soldier described how they would place people inside barrels and shoot at them, recalling the sight of blood in the barrels. Another mentioned an officer who later rose to a high rank in the Ministry of Defense. This officer allegedly pulled out his pistol and began executing prisoners, one by one. A third soldier, named Mizrahi Cohen, laughed as he recalled, "I didn't take prisoners. I killed them." He added, "I had a machine gun with 250 bullets, and I emptied it all." These accounts, shockingly, are not from the victims but from those who committed the massacre. If these are the confessions of the perpetrators trying to downplay the horror, imagine how much worse the victims' accounts must be. Most of the massacre survivors were displaced to refugee camps, some in Syria and others still living today in Al-Faradis, just a few kilometers from their original village, Tantura. For decades, survivors had no idea where their loved ones' bodies were buried. This question remained unanswered until May 2023, when an organization called Forensic Architecture conducted an investigation. By analyzing aerial photographs of Tantura taken between 1946 and 1949, before and after the massacre, they compared these images with modern maps and satellite data, reconstructing the site's changes. Combined with survivor testimonies, their report identified the locations of mass graves, two of which are near the old village cemetery and under a parking lot that serves a resort beach. Even today, if you search for these locations on Google, the first results will lead you to hotel bookings and recreational activities. All of this exists literally on top of execution sites and mass graves. The current appearance of Tantura is a metaphor for all of Israel, a thin veneer of Western modernization covering remnants of killings, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, just 1 meter beneath the surface. Dear viewer, everything I've narrated to you so far is based on Israeli sources, not Western ones, but Israeli. Arab sources contain even more horrific details, but there's a reason I chose these particular references. I wanted to showcase examples of the few Israeli voices that attempted to dig into the Nakba's truths and highlight the fates of those who dared to do so, all within the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. Take Theodore Katz, for example. After he interviewed the veterans and published his findings, he was hit with a defamation lawsuit by individuals who are, by definition, war criminals. His master's thesis was removed from the university library, and he was forced to retract his statements. His academic career was entirely destroyed. Then there's A.L. Wiseman, who founded Forensic Architecture, the organization whose recent investigation we discussed. He was somewhat luckier. His books were only banned in Israel, particularly his book Hollow Land, which highlights how Israeli settlement construction is systematically designed to suffocate and displace Palestinians. There are countless other examples of Israelis who attempted to discuss the Nakba and were silenced. In 2011, for instance, the Knesset passed a law known as the Nakba Law. This law allows the Israeli Finance Ministry to cut government funding for any institution that acknowledges the Nakba. For example, if a university or research institution hosts a lecture about the Nakba, the government can legally revoke its funding. Because of this law, many books were never published, articles never written, and films never produced, all to protect the narrative Israel wants to tell about itself. This censorship is particularly harsh when it comes to Jewish individuals who reject Zionism. They are labeled as self-hating Jews, a derogatory term. One prominent figure among them is the historian Ilan Pappé, who was essentially forced out of the University of Haifa. Pappé authored the famous book The 10 Myths About Israel, which debunks Israel's myths about itself, especially those aimed at Western audiences. The narrative Israel tells about itself and teaches its children portrays the Jewish people as a single, unified nation that has been persecuted for 2,000 years, culminating in the Holocaust. In this story, Israel is the heroic return of these Jews to a desolate land, where they used modern technology to transform it into a flourishing state. This myth borrows heavily from the Western archetype of the settler-pioneer, much like the European settlers in North America. But the truth, dear viewer, is that this entire story is fabricated, composed of outright lies and half-truths. It's a narrative designed to evoke admiration and sympathy while masking the horrors of ethnic cleansing and colonialism. Even the idea of the Jewish people as a single, unified nation is historically inaccurate. By the late 19th century, Jewish communities in Europe and the Arab world were vastly different in terms of language, culture, and social status. European Jews faced persecution and pogroms, while Arab Jews lived relatively peacefully within the Ottoman Empire, often holding prominent positions in society. The idea of a singular Jewish nation was a product of Zionist ideology, not historical reality. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, was a secular Austrian journalist who initially supported the idea of assimilation into European societies. However, after witnessing anti-Semitism during the Dreyfus Affair in France, he abandoned this view and proposed the establishment of a Jewish state. Herzl's vision was not rooted in religion, he even considered alternative locations like Argentina and Uganda. However, he eventually chose Palestine, not for its religious significance but because it was easier to sell the idea to European Jews by framing it as a return to their ancestral homeland. This ideological shift gave birth to the Zionist myth of a land without a people for a people without a land. Yet, by the late 19th century, Palestine was already a thriving society with a majority Muslim population, along with Christian and Jewish minorities. Cities like Jaffa were cultural and economic hubs with cinemas, theaters, and a port that was hundreds of years old. The Zionist movement's strategy in Palestine involved purchasing land and displacing Palestinian farmers. Wealthy absentee landlords, often living abroad, sold large tracts of land to Zionist organizations, which then evicted Palestinian tenants to make way for Jewish settlers. This process was facilitated by a policy of creating exclusively Jewish labor and infrastructure, ensuring minimal interaction with the local Palestinian population. Over time, the Zionist movement gained support from colonial powers, particularly Britain. During World War I, Britain saw the Zionist project as a strategic ally in the Middle East. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, paving the way for increased Jewish immigration under British mandate. However, the Palestinian resistance to British colonial rule and Zionist settlement grew stronger. Between 1936 and 1939, the Arab Revolt erupted, a widespread uprising against British policies and Jewish immigration. Britain responded with brutal force, killing thousands of Palestinians and crushing the revolt. Despite this, Zionist militias like the Haganah continued to grow, gaining military training and equipment from the British. By the time of the United Nations Partition Plan in 1947, which proposed dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, the Zionists were well prepared to implement their vision. The plan allocated 56% of the land to the Jewish state, despite Jews owning only 6% of the land and constituting about one-third of the population. What followed was the Nakba, or catastrophe, during which over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes. Hundreds of villages were destroyed, and massacres like the one in Tantura became emblematic of the violent birth of the Israeli state. The Nakba didn't just end with the displacement of Palestinians in 1948. It laid the foundation for decades of suffering, as Israel institutionalized its policies of land seizure, displacement, and ethnic cleansing. Entire generations of Palestinians have grown up as refugees, often only kilometers away from their original homes, unable to return due to Israeli laws and policies. The land they were forced to leave behind has been transformed into settlements, parks, and tourist resorts, erasing the memory of the Palestinian villages that once stood there. Israel has worked tirelessly to create a narrative that portrays itself as a small, vulnerable state under constant threat, despite its military dominance and its status as one of the world's most heavily armed nations. This narrative has been skillfully marketed to Western audiences, emphasizing Israel's democratic values and technological advancements while downplaying the oppression and dispossession of the Palestinian people. One of the most enduring myths is that Palestinians left their homes voluntarily during the Nakba, encouraged by Arab leaders who promised them they could return after the war. This claim has been thoroughly debunked by historians, including Israeli ones like Ilan Pappé. Evidence shows that most Palestinians were forcibly expelled or fled in fear of massacres like those in Tantura, Deir Yassin, and other villages. The Israeli narrative also insists that it seeks peace with its neighbors and portrays itself as the only party willing to compromise. However, its actions on the ground, expanding settlements, enforcing military rule in the West Bank, and maintaining a blockade on Gaza, tell a different story. The so-called peace process has often been a cover for consolidating Israeli control over Palestinian land. To this day, Palestinians continue to resist. They resist not just through protests and uprisings, but also by preserving their history and culture in the face of attempts to erase them. The story of Palestine is not just one of loss and displacement, it is also one of resilience and the enduring hope for justice. This is the truth that the world needs to hear, beyond the layers of propaganda and myth that have been constructed over decades. It is a story of a people who refuse to be forgotten, no matter how much effort is put into burying their history. Subscribe to the channel and watch the previous video.